Hello again, and welcome to Unit 5. The topic of this video is going to be symbolizing ambiguous sentences. In this unit, we'll also be reviewing derivations a little bit, talking about the topic of relevance. You'll understand that when we get to that unit, and talking a little bit about the notion of theorems. So for the most part, at this point, we're over the hump of Chapter 1, and we're working on consolidating what we've learned, adding smaller topics as we go. The derivation system is really in addition to learning how to symbolize, are the main challenges in Chapter 1. And we're making good progress on those. So, we're going to talk about ambiguous symbolization in this video. So let's just remember we have a removal test. And what is the removal test? Well, it's a method to find a sentence's main connective. And if we remember, the idea is that when you add a connective like a negation or like conditional to one or two other sentences, the right number of sentences, then you get a new sentence. You build a new sentence. And that symbol that you add, that's the new sentence's main connective, the one that was added to the things that were previously sentences and that were already in, the other connectives were already in other sentences. So if you find the main connective and remove it, you should be left with the appropriate number of parts. 1 if the connective is a negation, 2 if it's a conditional. And if on removing the proposed connective, you're not left with the right number of sentences, then that connective is not the main connective of the whole sentence, it's the main connective of some smaller component sentence. So that's the removal test. How we tell. Is this the main connective? Well, when we remove it, we're left with the right number of parts, it is the main connective, and if we're left with the wrong number of parts, it's not the main connective. Okay. So there's a problem with the main connective and sentences of English. So you'll remember, so let's take a look at this sentence. Lance wins the tour, assuming that he wins the mountains, provided that he exerts himself. Now, this sentence contains two pieces of logical vocabulary. It contains assuming that, and it contains provided that. Now, so this sentence, what happens if we remove the assuming that, as we have here ellipses instead of assuming that? Well, we have two sentences. We're left with two sentences. Lance wins the tour on the one hand, and he wins the mountains, provided that he exerts himself on the other. And those are both component sentences. So, assuming that passes the removal test, we're left with the right number of sentences. Now, what about the provided that? Well, if we remove the provided that, then we have Lance wins the tour, assuming that he wins the mountains, and that's a sentence. And then we have he exerts himself, and that's another sentence. So provided that also passes the removal test. In both cases, whichever piece of vocabulary we remove, we should be left with two sentences, and that is what we are left with. So this looks like there's a problem. There are two connectives that pass the removal test, and so we want to know, well, which is the main connective? Well, the answer is that the sentence is grammatically ambiguous. Right? Remember, we talked in the beginning of the course about how we want to have a symbolic language. We have a symbolic language because, on the one hand, we want a language that's not grammatically ambiguous, but on the other hand, natural languages are grammatically ambiguous, and this is an example of that. Some homework problems are intentionally ambiguous, and when you're presented with such a problem, you have to produce multiple symbolizations. You have to produce symbolizations of the different readings. So let's take a look at that in the program. So here we have a sentence, Snape sulks if it is not the case that Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew peers. So we'll go and take a look at this problem in the program. So in the program, here we have this sentence, Snape sulks if it is not the case that Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew peers. So we have an if here. That's one piece of logical vocabulary. We have it is not the case that. That's another piece of logical vocabulary. And then, let's see, we can split this. Actually, let's not split that there. So the if, and then the it is not the case that. Oops, I'm deleting too much. And finally, we have the assuming. And we have to figure out what are we going to do with these. Well, in fact, let's consider which ones of these pass the removal test. So does the if pass the removal test? Well, if we remove the if, then we have on the one hand, on one side, Snape sulks, and that's a sentence. And we have on the other hand, it is not the case that Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew appears. And that's also a sentence. So the if could be the main connective. As it turns out, also the assuming could be the main connective. If we remove assuming, we have Pettigrew appears and Snake sulks if it is not the case that Remus roars. And so again, we're left with two sentences. So both it and assuming that, or assuming pass the removal test, because either one we remove, we're left with two sentences, which is what we should be left with if it's the main connective. And so this sentence is ambiguous. Either of those, either the if or the assuming that could be the main connective. So let's start with the assuming that and do that one first. So we'll say we're going to put in a conditional. So assuming is a synonym of if, and it attaches to Pettigrew appears. Whatever if or its synonyms attached to go in the antecedent. So Pettigrew appears goes in the antecedent, and the rest goes in the consequent. Good so far. Pettigrew appears, that's atomic P. Now, Snape sulks if Snape sulks if it is not the case that Remus roars. Well, it is not the case that. Can that be the main connective? No. If we remove it, we're left with a sentence, Remus roars, but also Snape sulks if, and so we're left with a sentence plus some garbage, and that means that the it is not the case that is not the main connective, because if it were, we would be left with only one sentence. That means that the if is the main connective. So we will put in the if. The if flags it is not the case that Remus roars. Well, that means that the it is not the case that is the main connective. We should put Remus roars here. Oops, that's a little too much. And so we'll put in now R for the atomic Remus roars. And here we have Snape sulks. Let's get rid of the caps. And that's S. Oops. Let's try this one more time. There we go. So that's one answer. If P, then if not R, then S. So that's one reading of this sentence. But this sentence is ambiguous, and so we want to try now symbolizing it another way. So we noted initially that both assuming and if could be the main connective. So now we're going to try it if is the main connective. So let's, if you click here, you can go to truncate. Truncate chops stuff off. So let's say we click here and we truncate. It cuts off everything beneath there. All right, so we're going to say that the if, and the keyboard shortcut for that is Control-Shift-T. So the if hooks onto this, so that's going to go here, and Snape sulks is going to go there. So we have over here Snape sulks in the consequent, that's atomic S. Now we have it is not the case that Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew appears. Now let's consider what is the main connective of this sentence. Well, does it is not the case that pass the test? Yes. If we remove it is not the case that, we're left with Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew appears, and that's a sentence, which is what we should be left with. But what about if we remove assuming that? Well, again, we're left with two sentences. Pettigrew appears, and it is not the case that Remus roars. That means that assuming that could also be the main connective. So this sentence is, we still have multiple readings to go. Either it is not the case that can be the main connective, or assuming can be the main connective. So let's do the it is not the case that first, and then we put in the remainder, Remus roars, assuming Pettigrew appears. Okay, assuming is an if. Assuming attaches to the antecedent, and Remus roars, the remainder is in the consequent. So this is going to be a P, and that is going to be an R. And if we check it, it still says correct, and we have another answer. Now we can go back here, and we could do one more answer. We noted that both it is not the case that and assuming passed the removal test. We did it with it is not the case that being the main connective, so now it's doing with assuming that being the main connective, so we'll truncate the work, and we'll say assuming is going to be our main connective. Assuming is an if. Assuming attaches to the antecedent, so the antecedent is there. And then it is not the case that Remus roars. The remainder goes there. That's a negation of Remus roars. And so we'll have R there, and let's put in the P for pettigrew peers, and that's our last symbolization. So we get 3 symbolizations from this sentence. Now, when you do your homework, it's going to be slightly different because, let's see. Where are you? There we go. So you have 1028A and B, for example. And note it says ambiguous here. So what's going to happen is you'll do 1028A, you'll enter an answer, you'll save it, it'll be correct. And the way I did it, I redid the answer. So you don't do that. So you'll enter an answer in 1028A, and then you go to 1028B. And if you enter the same answer as you put in for 1028A, then it's going to say incorrect. So you have to find a second reading. And it doesn't matter which one you put in first for A or B. When you put in whichever reading you put in for A, it'll say, okay, good, I got that one. And then when you go to B, it'll compare the reading, the second symbolization that you're doing, with whatever you chose to put in for A. So you just have to do both of them, A and B, and you have to put in one reading for one and one reading for the other. And it doesn't matter in which order. So that's how you're going to handle ambiguous symbolization. Okay, good. So that's the discussion of symbolization for this week. There may have been yes, I believe there was one difficult symbolization problem, so I'll also be posting a discussion of that problem. But the rest of the sort of new material will be on derivations. So, happy symbolizing.